My name is Evan Carter. I'm 46 years old, and for 18 of those years, I was a conservation officer with the Michigan Department of Natural Resources. Before that, I did 6 years in the Army, 75th Ranger Regiment. I'm not telling you this to brag. I'm telling you this so you understand that I am not a man given to flights of fancy. I am trained to observe, to track, to understand the wilderness and the animals in it. I have been in situations where my life depended on a calm mind and a steady hand. I have seen things, but nothing, not in the sands of Afghanistan or the deepest woods of the Upper Peninsula, prepared me for what happened in the autumn of 2011. The place was a small, rustic cabin my family had owned for generations, tucked away on a tract of private land that bordered the vast expanse of the Ottawa National Forest. It was our yearly tradition, a final hunting trip before the heavy snows sealed the North Country. There were 4 of us that year: me, my partner Cal, Corey, and Corey's cousin Brian. Cal and I had worked together for a decade. He was as solid as the granite bedrock of the UP. Corey was another DNR officer from a different district, an ex-Marine, tough as nails and twice as sharp. Brian was the odd one out. He was a software developer from Ann Arbor, a city kid through and through. It was his first time on a real hunting trip, and he was determined to prove he could hang with us. He was a good kid, but he saw the woods as a theme park, not a living, breathing entity that demands respect. We arrived on a Thursday afternoon in late October. The air was crisp, holding the clean, sharp scent of pine and decaying leaves that signals the coming of winter. The trees were a riot of color, fiery oranges and brilliant golds set against the dark green of the pines. We spent the first few hours airing out the cabin, splitting firewood, and getting our gear organized. The cabin was primitive: no electricity, no running water, just a wood stove for heat, a propane lamp for light, and 4 bunks. It was our sanctuary, a place to disconnect from the modern world. That first evening was filled with the easy camaraderie of old friends. We grilled venison steaks over an open fire, drank cheap beer, and listened to Brian's endless stream of jokes. The sky was clear, and the stars were so bright they felt close enough to touch. Everything was exactly as it should be: normal. The next morning, we split into pairs to scout for deer sign. Cal and I went west, following a ridge that overlooked a dense cedar swamp. Corey and Brian headed east, toward a clearing where we'd had luck in previous years. It was a perfect morning for tracking. A light frost covered the ground, making every print stand out in sharp relief. We moved slowly, speaking in low tones, our senses alive to the world around us. The forest was quiet, but it was a peaceful quiet, the gentle murmur of a world waking up. We found plenty of sign: deer tracks, scrapes, rubs on young saplings. Everything pointed to a successful hunt. We met back at the cabin around noon. Corey and Brian were already there, and the mood had changed. The easy laughter from the night before was gone. Corey was standing by the porch, his face grim, a look I'd seen on him only once before, when he'd found a lost hiker who hadn't survived the night. Brian was sitting on the steps, pale and quiet. He was trying to make a joke of it, but his voice was thin, his eyes wide. "You guys are not going to believe what we found," Corey said, his voice low. He just nodded toward the east. "Come on, you need to see this." We followed him back along the trail they had taken. About a half-mile from the cabin, we came to the clearing. In the center of the open space was a doe, or what was left of one. I've seen hundreds of animal kills in my career. I've seen what wolves do, what bears and coyotes and cougars do. They are messy, violent affairs, driven by hunger. This was different. This was wrong. The doe was laid out on its back, its legs pointing straight up towards the sky, almost as if it had been deliberately posed. The hide had been peeled back from the torso with a precision that was unnerving. But the truly bizarre part was the rib cage. It had been cracked open, and each rib was snapped cleanly at the spine, splayed outwards like some grotesque, bloody flower. The internal organs were gone. Not eaten on the spot, just gone. There were no drag marks, no signs of scavenging birds, no pooling blood. The ground around the carcass was pristine, as if the whole thing had been carefully staged. "What the hell did this?" Cal breathed, walking a slow circle around the scene. He looked at me, his eyes asking a question I couldn't answer. I knelt, examining the ground. The frost was gone now, but the earth was still soft. I looked for tracks. Bear tracks are unmistakable, 5 toes, a wide palm. Wolf tracks are large, canine. I found nothing. Nothing except the hoof prints of the doe herself, showing where she had struggled briefly before going down. It was as if her killer had floated in, done its work, and floated out. "Maybe it was a bear," Brian said, his voice a little too loud. "A really big, weird bear." He was trying to convince himself more than us. "Bears don't do this, Brian," Corey said flatly. "They don't break every rib and lay an animal out like a biology project. And they sure as hell don't clean up after themselves." He pointed to a small pine tree nearby. About 8 feet up the trunk, there were deep gouges in the bark. 4 parallel claw marks, each one thick as my thumb and sunk deep into the wood. Whatever made them had reach and power far beyond any black bear I'd ever encountered. We stood there in silence for a long time, the wrongness of the scene seeping into our bones. The peaceful quiet of the morning forest now felt menacing. We were being watched. I couldn't shake the feeling. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was poachers with a twisted sense of humor. Maybe it was some local cult. But the claw marks on that tree, no human did that. And the lack of tracks, it made no sense. We decided to head back to the cabin, the excitement of the hunt completely extinguished, replaced by a cold, creeping unease. We carried our rifles at the ready, scanning the trees, our ears straining for any sound out of place. The woods no longer felt like our sanctuary. They felt like someone else's territory. That evening, the mood in the cabin was thick with unspoken tension. Brian tried to break the ice with a few jokes, but they fell flat. We ate our dinner mostly in silence, the propane lamp casting long, dancing shadows on the log walls. Every gust of wind rattling the windows made us jump. We kept the fire in the wood stove roaring, more for the comforting light than the heat. Corey, ever the pragmatist, cleaned his rifle methodically, the metallic click-clack of the bolt echoing in the quiet room. "Whatever did that to the deer," he said without looking up. "It's big and it's strong. We stick together tomorrow. No one goes out alone. Agreed?" We all agreed, but agreeing didn't make the feeling go away. Around 9 o'clock, we heard the first sound. It was a scraping noise, coming from the west wall of the cabin. It was slow, deliberate. Scrape, pause, scrape. It wasn't the sound of a branch rubbing against the logs. It sounded like something hard and sharp being dragged across the wood. "Just a porcupine," Brian said, trying to sound nonchalant. But his knuckles were white where he gripped his beer can. "Porcupines don't sound like that," Cal said quietly, his eyes fixed on the wall. He picked up his shotgun, a big 12-gauge, and held it across his lap. The scraping stopped. For a few minutes, there was only the sound of the crackling fire and our own breathing. Then we heard something else. The front doorknob began to jiggle. It wasn't a frantic rattling. It was a slow, deliberate turning, back and forth, as if something was testing it, trying to figure out how it worked. My blood ran cold. No animal does that. A bear might claw at a door or even smash it down, but it wouldn't try to work the knob. Corey was on his feet in an instant, his rifle leveled at the door. I moved to the front window, peering cautiously through a gap in the curtains. I saw nothing but darkness and the silhouettes of the trees. The rattling stopped. Silence descended again, heavier and more menacing than before. We stayed up for another hour, rifles in hand, but there were no more sounds. Eventually, exhaustion won out. We agreed to take watches. Corey took the first, Cal the second, and I would take the third. Brian, who had no experience with firearms, was told to just try and get some sleep. I was woken up by Cal shaking my shoulder. It was my turn. The cabin was dark, except for the dull red glow of the embers in the stove. Corey and Brian were asleep in their bunks. Cal looked exhausted. "Anything?" I whispered. He shook his head. Quiet as a tomb since that thing with the doorknob. He handed me his rifle and climbed into his bunk. I sat in the chair by the stove, the rifle across my lap, and listened. For the first hour, there was nothing. The deep, profound silence of the northern woods at night. I started to relax, telling myself we'd overreacted. It was probably just a series of strange coincidences. A weird kill scene, a raccoon at the door. My rational mind was desperate to reassert control. Then I saw it. I was looking out the main window, the one that faced the dense tree line about 50 yards away. The moon was nearly full, casting a pale silvery light over the landscape. For just a second, a shape detached itself from the shadows of the pines. It was massive, far taller than a man. It moved from the cover of one tree to another, and it didn't move on 4 legs. It was upright, bipedal. The shoulders were impossibly broad, the torso thick and powerful. I couldn't make out any details, no color, no face, just a hulking black silhouette against the moonlit snow. It was there for a heartbeat, and then it was gone, melting back into the darkness. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My ranger training kicked in, suppressing the initial wave of panic. Observe. Assess. It wasn't a bear. A bear on its hind legs is a clumsy, temporary thing. This moved with a fluid, predatory grace. It wasn't a man. No man was that big, that broad. My mind cycled through all the logical possibilities and came up empty. What I had just seen was impossible, but I had seen it. I spent the rest of my watch staring at that tree line, my heart pounding a steady, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I didn't see it again. When morning came, I told the others what I had seen. Cal and Corey listened intently, their faces serious. Brian scoffed. "Come on, Evan, you were half asleep. You saw a shadow, a bear, a trick of the moonlight." "It wasn't a bear, Brian," I said, my voice harder than I intended. "It was on 2 legs, and it moved like nothing I've ever seen." "So what are you saying? It was Bigfoot?" He laughed. "We're in the UP, not the Pacific Northwest." "I'm saying I don't know what it was," Corey cut in, his eyes on me. "But I believe you saw something. After that deer yesterday, and the sounds last night. We're not staying here another night. We pack up after breakfast, and we get the hell out." We all agreed to that. The plan was simple. Eat, pack, and leave. The sooner, the better. But Brian, in his attempt to prove he wasn't scared, was being deliberately difficult. While we were packing our gear inside, he decided he needed to chop more firewood. We had more than enough to get us through breakfast, but he was trying to make a point. "I'll just be a minute," he said, grabbing the splitting axe from the porch. "Can't leave the place a mess for the next guys." "Brian, just leave it," Corey said, his voice tight with frustration. Get in here and help us pack." "Relax, man. It's broad daylight. Sasquatch is probably sleeping in," he smirked, and headed out to the woodpile about 30 yards from the cabin. We went back to packing, keeping an eye on him through the window. We heard the rhythmic thump of the axe splitting logs. It was a normal, comforting sound. For a few minutes, it almost felt like things were okay again. Then the chopping stopped. We waited, expecting it to start again. It didn't. "Brian?" Corey called out. Silence. Then came the scream. It wasn't a yell of surprise. It was a wet, gurgling shriek of pure agony and terror that was cut off with a sickening crunch. We didn't hesitate. Corey, Cal, and I grabbed our rifles and burst out the door. The 30 yards to the woodpile felt like a mile. What we saw there has been burned into my memory, a permanent fixture in my nightmares. The thing I had seen in silhouette was standing there, in the full light of morning, and it was holding Brian. It was immense. It had to be 8 feet tall, maybe more. Its body was covered in coarse, dark fur, like a wolf's, but its anatomy was a twisted mockery of man and beast. It stood on 2 powerful, digitigrade legs, the joints bent backwards like a dog's. Its arms were too long for its body, ending in huge, 5-fingered hands that looked eerily human, except for the thick, yellowed claws that tipped each finger. But the head, dear God, the head. It was the head of a monstrous wolf, or a German shepherd, with a long snout, pointed ears, and jaws that seemed impossibly wide. And the eyes. They were not the eyes of an animal. They were a pale, luminous yellow, and they stared at us with a cold, calculating intelligence. It held Brian off the ground with one hand, his body limp and broken. The other hand was clamped over his face. As we watched, frozen in horror, it casually twisted its wrist. There was a sharp crack, like a branch snapping, and Brian's head lolled to the side at an unnatural angle. Then, with no more effort than it would take to toss a piece of firewood, it threw Brian's body at the cabin. It hit the log wall with a heavy, wet thud and slid to the ground. For a second, the world seemed to stop. The 3 of us, trained and armed men, just stood there, unable to process what we were seeing. The creature turned its full attention to us. It let out a low growl that vibrated in my chest, a sound full of malice and predatory confidence. Then it took a step towards us. That broke the spell. "Inside! Now!" Corey screamed. The ex-Marine took over. We fell back to the cabin, firing our rifles as we went. I saw my rounds hit its chest, kicking up tufts of dark fur, but it didn't even flinch. It was like shooting at a brick wall. We scrambled inside, slammed the heavy oak door, and threw the bolt. Cal and I immediately started shoving the heavy dining table against it, while Corey ran to the windows. "Fields of fire!" he yelled, his voice a tight, controlled bark of command. "Evan, front window. Cal, the side. I'll cover the back." We moved to our positions, our minds finally catching up to the terror. Brian was dead, and the thing that killed him was right outside our door. We heard it circling the cabin, its heavy footfalls crunching on the frosty ground. A moment later, its face appeared at the front window where I was stationed. It was so close, I could see the texture of its leathery black nose, the flecks of Brian's blood in the fur around its snout. It stared at me, those intelligent yellow eyes meeting mine. There was no rage in them, no animalistic fury. There was just a cold, predatory focus. It was studying me, assessing me. It raised a clawed hand and tapped gently on the glass. Tap, tap, tap. It was mocking us. Then the assault began. It didn't just throw itself at the walls. It was systematic. It started by ramming the door, the whole cabin shaking with each impact. The heavy oak held, but the frame began to splinter. Cal and I added our weight to the table, barricading it. Then it moved to the windows, smashing the glass with its fists. We fired at it, but it was impossibly fast, ducking away from the window each time we raised our rifles. Corey was yelling instructions, trying to keep us focused. "Don't waste ammo! Fire only when you have a clear shot. Aim for the head." But getting a clear shot was almost impossible. It was smart. It used the corners of the cabin for cover, darting out to strike and then retreating. We heard a loud twang from outside, followed by the propane lamp flickering and dying, plunging us into the gloomy morning light filtering through the broken windows. "It cut the propane line," Cal said, his voice strained. "It's thinking. It's trying to box us in." Then we heard a new sound, the rhythmic chopping of an axe. My blood turned to ice. It had found the splitting axe Brian had dropped. It was methodically hacking at the door, the heavy thunk of the steel blade biting deep into the wood, echoing through the small cabin. Splinters of wood flew into the room with each strike. It wasn't just a monster, it was a tool user. It understood leverage and weakness. And then we realized the most terrifying thing of all. There wasn't one of them. We heard a low, guttural bark from the woods to the east, and the creature at our door answered with a series of clicks and growls. It was communicating, coordinating. A second set of heavy footfalls approached from the back of the cabin. Now we were surrounded. The next hour was a blur of controlled chaos and primal fear. The two creatures worked in tandem. One continued to work on the door with the axe, while the other began tearing at the logs of the back wall. They were trying to breach the cabin from two sides at once. We were constantly moving, trying to cover both threats, the small space of the cabin feeling like a death trap. They threw rocks the size of my head through the shattered windows, forcing us to take cover. One rock smashed the wood stove, sending a shower of hot embers across the floor. We were losing. Our ammunition was running low. The door was beginning to give way, and we could hear the grinding sound of claws tearing through the logs at the back. Hope was a dwindling resource. We were exhausted, terrified, and trapped. It was Corey who came up with the plan. It was a desperate, last-ditch effort, the kind of plan you make when you know you're already dead. "The truck," he said, his face pale and smeared with soot. "It's our only chance, but we'll never make it across the clearing, not with both of them out there." He looked at the two full kerosene lanterns we had on the mantel. We need a diversion, a big one. I knew what he was thinking. He started stuffing a rag into the neck of one of the lanterns, a Molotov cocktail. "Cal, Evan," he said, his voice steady, despite the trembling of his hands. "When I throw this, the one at the back should be drawn to the fire. The one at the door is focused. That's your window. You run for the truck. Don't stop. Don't look back. Just go." "What about you?" Cal asked, his voice cracking. "We're not leaving you, Corey." "This is not a negotiation, Corporal," he barked, slipping back into the language of the Marines. It was the only time I ever heard him pull rank. "That's an order. You get out of here. You tell people what happened." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a terrible certainty. "You get my family a flag. You tell them I didn't die scared." Before we could argue, he lit the rag. The back wall of the cabin finally gave way with a splintering crash. A massive clawed arm reached through the new opening, groping blindly. Corey didn't hesitate. He ran towards the breach, the lit lantern held high. "Semper Fi, you ugly bastard," he screamed, and hurled the lantern. It arced through the air and smashed against the creature's shoulder. There was a whoosh as the kerosene ignited, engulfing the creature's upper body in a ball of fire. It let out a deafening roar of pain and fury. a sound that shook the very foundations of the cabin. It stumbled back, beating at the flames with its massive hands. "Go! Go now!" Corey yelled at us. The creature at the front, distracted by the roar of its companion, turned its head for just a second. That was our chance. Cal kicked the barricade away from the door, and I wrenched it open. We burst out into the cold morning air and ran. We didn't dare look back. I heard Corey firing his rifle from inside the cabin, the shots echoing behind us. Then I heard a terrible, final scream. The 50-yard dash to my pickup truck felt like an eternity. The world narrowed to the bouncing shape of Cal's back in front of me, and the desperate pounding of my own feet. I fumbled for the keys in my pocket, my fingers numb and clumsy. The second creature, the one that hadn't been set on fire, was already recovering from the surprise. I heard its thunderous footsteps behind us, closing the distance with terrifying speed. I reached the truck and jammed the key into the driver's side door, wrenching it open. "Get in!" I yelled at Cal, who was scrambling into the passenger seat. I threw myself behind the wheel, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. The engine sputtered, caught, and roared to life. In that same instant, the creature slammed into the side of the truck with the force of a car crash. The whole vehicle rocked violently, the passenger side window shattering, spraying Cal with glass. I didn't think. I stomped on the gas pedal. The tires spun on the gravel, fighting for traction, and then they bit. The truck leaped forward, fishtailing wildly down the narrow logging road. I risked a glance in the rearview mirror. The creature was standing in the middle of the road, its fur singed and smoking in places. It wasn't pursuing. It just stood there, watching us go, its yellow eyes burning with an intelligent hatred that chilled me to the bone. Then the trees obscured it from view. We didn't slow down. I drove like a madman, the truck bouncing and sliding on the rutted road. We were both in shock, breathing in ragged gasps. Cal was bleeding from a dozen cuts on his face and arms from the shattered window. I looked over at him. His eyes were wide, staring blankly ahead. He was muttering Corey's name over and over again. It took us 20 minutes to reach the paved county road. The moment the tires hit the asphalt, I felt a wave of relief so profound it almost made me pass out. We were out. We were alive. But the relief was immediately followed by a crushing wave of grief and guilt. Corey and Brian were gone. We had left them behind. I drove straight to the Michigan State Police Post in Ironwood. We must have been a hell of a sight, stumbling in there. We were covered in dirt, soot, and Cal's blood. Our clothes were torn. We were babbling, hysterical, trying to explain what had happened. We told them everything: the deer, the sounds, the creature, the attack, Corey's sacrifice. We probably sounded insane. They separated us, put us in different interrogation rooms. I told my story, over and over again, to a series of troopers with impassive, skeptical faces. They asked me if we had been drinking, if we had taken any drugs. They brought in a conservation officer from the local district who listened to my story about the deer carcass and the tracks, his expression a mixture of pity and disbelief. They treated us not as victims, but as suspects or madmen. Eventually, a search party was organized. They went out to the cabin. They found it, of course. They found the wreckage, the blood, the spent shell casings. They found what was left of Brian and Corey. The official story, the one that went into the reports, was that our hunting party had been attacked by a large, unusually aggressive black bear. They said it was probably rabid. Our frantic, desperate story about an 8-foot-tall bipedal wolf creature was dismissed as a shared delusion, a product of trauma and shock. They said that in the panic of a bear attack, our minds had simply invented a monster. They explained away every piece of evidence. The axe marks on the door? We must have done that ourselves in a panic, trying to get in or out. The cut propane line? A lucky swipe from the bear's claw. The lack of tracks? The ground was too hard, they said, too covered in pine needles. It was all neat, tidy, and logical. And it was a complete lie. Our rifles were confiscated for ballistic testing as part of the investigation. We never saw them again. We were released after 2 days of questioning. The case was officially closed. Tragic hunting accident. Bear attack. End of story. I felt a helplessness and a rage I had never known. We had seen our friends butchered, had fought for our lives against something impossible, and the world refused to believe us. They chose a comfortable lie over a terrifying truth. As we were leaving the station, a grizzled old sheriff's deputy, a man who must have been a week from retirement, pulled me aside. He led me to a quiet corner of the hallway, out of earshot of the others. He looked old and tired, his eyes carrying the weight of a lifetime of seeing things people shouldn't have to see. "Son," he said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper, "I'm officially supposed to tell you you're suffering from shock, but I'm not here officially." He leaned in closer. "You need to listen to me. You and your friend, you don't ever go back up there. You hear me? Ever. And you stop telling that story. You tell people it was a bear, just like the report says. You let it go." "But it wasn't a bear," I insisted, my voice pleading. "You have to believe me. We saw it." He held up a hand to silence me. "I believe you," he said, and the simple words hit me with the force of a physical blow. "You're not the first. My granddaddy told me stories, heard 'em my whole life. People who go into the deep woods up here and don't come back. Or they come back, changed, babbling about a monster that walks like a man, but has the head of a wolf." He shook his head slowly. "There's no name for it in the official books, but the old folks, the Anishinaabe, they have names for it. Locals who've seen things, they just call it the Dogman. It's a bad thing, son, an old thing, the kind of thing you're better off pretending doesn't exist." He patted my shoulder, a gesture that was meant to be comforting, but felt like a final nail in the coffin of my sanity. "Go home. Move away from the woods. Forget what you saw. It's the only way you'll stay sane." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving me alone with the terrible, validated truth. That was 12 years ago. Kat and I both quit the DNR within the month. We couldn't do it anymore. We couldn't walk into the woods we once loved without seeing those yellow eyes staring back at us from the shadows. Cal moved to Phoenix, Arizona. He said he wanted to live somewhere he could see for 100 miles in every direction, a place with no trees tall enough to hide a monster. We still talk on the phone sometimes, but we never talk about that weekend. We don't have to. It's always there, the unspoken horror that binds us together. I moved downstate, to a suburb of Detroit. I work a desk job now, processing insurance claims. Anesthetizingly boring. I haven't been north of Saginaw since it happened. I can't stand the sound of wind in pine trees. I can't be in a house alone at night without checking the locks a dozen times. Every time I see a large dog, a German shepherd, my heart seizes in my chest. The nightmares are less frequent now, but they still come. In them, I'm always back in that cabin, listening to the axe fall on the door, knowing that Corey is about to die for me. I always wake up just before the creature's face appears at the window. I live with the guilt every day. The guilt of surviving when Brian and Corey didn't. The guilt of running. I did what Corey told me to do. I told people what happened, and it did no good. No one listened. No one wanted to listen. The world is built on a foundation of things we can explain and understand. My story, our story, was a crack in that foundation, and the official response was to pave it over as quickly as possible. Sometimes I spend my nights online, falling down rabbit holes of folklore and cryptozoology. I've found other stories, hundreds of them, from all over the world, but especially from the deep woods of North America. Fleeting glimpses, strange howls, livestock mutilations, missing persons. Most are easily dismissed, but some have the ring of truth. They are told by credible people, hunters, police officers, soldiers, people like me. People who saw something impossible and had their lives shattered by it. We are a quiet, scattered community of survivors, isolated by a truth that the rest of the world refuses to see. I am telling you this now because I have to. Because Corey died so that someone could. He died to get the story out. Maybe I'm just a crazy man telling a ghost story. Maybe it was all just a bear and a traumatized mind. I hope that's the case. I truly do. Because if it's not, if what I saw was real, then the world is a much darker and more dangerous place than you can possibly imagine. There are things in the deep, quiet places of the world that are ancient and intelligent and hostile. They watch us from the edges of our civilization, from the shadows just beyond the firelight. So the next time you decide to go camping or hiking deep in a national forest, far from any road, and you get that feeling that you're being watched, don't dismiss it. The next time you hear a branch snap in the woods, just a little too close to your tent at night, don't tell yourself it's just an animal. Pack your things and leave. Get back to the light. Get back to the safety of your own world. Because their world, the one that lives in the heart of the darkness, is not a place you want to be. Trust me, I've been there, and I never truly came back. My name is Evan Carter, and I am a survivor. But some part of me, the part that used to love the woods, died in that cabin 12 years ago, alongside my friends.